1. This happened about 17 years ago when I was 19. My boyfriend and I were living in the city in a tiny apartment, and after a year of living there, we decided to move to the burbs. We moved to a house that was part of a huge complex of other houses and townhouses. We were really excited to have more room and a backyard as we really wanted to get a dog. We weren't familiar with this suburb and didn't have any friends or know anyone in the area. Compared to the hustle and bustle of the city, everyone seemed pretty friendly, and we were excited to make some new friends. Our house was at the far end of the complex on the corner. On the other side of our fence was a car park that was attached to a small bowling club. I worked in the city and caught a train to work. It was a 15-minute walk to the station from my home. My shift was 10 a.m. to 7 p.m., so by the time I was getting off the train to come home, it was about 8-ish. We had been living there almost a couple of weeks. One night after work, a work friend and I had dinner in the city before I caught my train home. It was 10-ish, and the train flew right past my stop. The next station was where the train terminated for 30 minutes before heading back towards the city. There were a lot of problems with our public transport system during this time. Late trains, lines closed during peak hour, services cancelled, etc. Sometimes trains would miss stopping at a train station to make the time up, but they wouldn't tell you it wouldn't be stopping at the designated stop. You would find out when the train didn't stop. I was pissed off. It had been a long day at work. Work friend and I had done a lot of venting over dinner about work. It was late, I was tired, and I wasn't sure which way to walk as I didn't know this area at all. I was going to wait for the train to head back to the city and stay on for one stop. But there was no staff or anyone at the station, and it wouldn't move until 30 minutes anyway. So I reasoned that by the time the train left the station, I would probably be close to home if I started walking. So I decided to follow the road that was parallel to the train line. There wasn't many street lights, and the streets were dark as fuck. I thought if I keep heading in this direction, sooner or later, I will get to a street that I was familiar with and would be able to find my way home. I kept walking with the train line on my right-hand side until the train line curved to the right and the street curved to the left, where the streets looked even darker. I remember having a little tainty haha, so I stopped and lit up a smoke. I grew up watching Unsolved Mysteries as a kid, and loved it, but Robert Stack's voice and the music freaked me out. In my head I could hear Robert Stack saying, "She was getting off the train and was last seen lighting up a smoke." I told myself to stop being silly, but that I should be alert. A few blocks down and I still have no idea where I am. This was way before maps on smartphones, and I didn't have any credit, so I couldn't ring my boyfriend. And there was no public phones. Not long after my smoke, a car turned the corner. I don't know why, but my instinct was to hide behind a tree, which I did. They drove very slowly, and my heart was beating so fast I thought they would overhear it. They got to the end of the street and turned the corner. I wondered if my Robert Stack impressions had led me to being paranoid, so I wrote it off as maybe they were lost or something and kept walking. Then I saw the car turn another corner. I didn't hide this time, because I thought I was just being paranoid and thought they will drive by and I will realize how silly I am. Except they slowed down again. The car had tinted windows, so I couldn't see who or how many people, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I ignored them, put my head up like I didn't care about them, and kept walking, keeping an eye on the houses that had a light on, in case I needed to run to them for help. Then they turned the corner. Over the next few blocks I started to run. I still had no idea where I was. Every so often the car would turn around the street I was in, but this time I made sure to hide behind a tree or someone's parked car. The car was going around the blocks, I presume trying to find me. So when it was out of sight, I would make a mad dash, and when I could hear the car nearby and seeing the car lights as it turned the corner, my heart sank and I would hide. I was tempted to knock on someone's door for help, but I kept telling myself that it was all in my head. I think because I didn't want to believe it was really happening. After what seemed like forever, in the distance I could see a park that I recognized was on the other side of the bowling club, which was next to our house. Finally. So I ran towards the park. The car is still driving around and I am still hiding when I can hear it nearby. I can hear the car revving its engine like it was taunting me. So I get to the park and start running with energy I didn't even know I had. The car comes around the corner along the street the park is on, but I am running diagonally across the park and I have nowhere to hide. The car speeds up and screeches to a halt a few times and starts revving again, but I don't even look back. The car starts driving again. There was a few different entries into the complex I lived in, as it was huge and covered a whole block. One driveway was about 5 houses down from my house. As soon as I got to it, I stopped to make sure I couldn't hear the car close by. So I made like Usain Bolt and sprinted to our house. I fumbled with my keys, unlocked the front door, and ran to the bedroom where my boyfriend, who was a security guard, was sleeping. I shook him and cried someone was following me, and he mumbled something and rolled over. Yeah, thanks, fuckwit. I walked out to the lounge room, shaking like a leaf, and realized that I still had a plastic bag around my wrist, which had a jumper in it. I had bought that night before dinner. I put it down with my bag that was over my shoulder. I still remember that it was a polo sport bag, and went outside for a smoke. It was just after 11, so it had taken me an hour to get home, though it felt like I was running around for hours. I started crying, and then I heard the car again. I stopped crying, and from where I was standing I could see the taillights of the car as it drove up the road where the bowling club and park were. I crouched down and soon lit another smoke and listened as the car drove up and down. I was so freaked out that they were looking for me. Needless to say, I didn't sleep much that night. About a week or so later, I was getting my nails done. The lady was asking me questions about how I was settling into the neighborhood, and I said really well, except being followed home the other night. As I was telling her the story, she looked at me with the biggest eyes. She then told me her daughter was followed last week, and said I wonder if it was the same people. I asked what car it was. I hadn't given her a description of it when I told her my story, and she told me what her daughter, who was a couple of years younger than me, described. And it was the same car, and it happened in the same area. She said there were 2 men in the car, and they pulled over and offered her a lift, and she said no, but they were insisting she get in. The passenger even reached behind to open the back door for her from inside the car, but she kept walking. Luckily for her, some friends of her brother were a few houses down, and they were outside, so she went to them, and as she was pointing to the car and telling them what they said, the car sped off. We were both freaking out. She said they went to the cops, but nothing could be done as nothing happened. She said they asked if they could at least make a note of it in case another girl reported something similar, and they said they couldn't do that. Needless to say, I didn't report my experience as I felt they would have said the same thing to me. Those streets were really dark and no one else was around, and whilst I am feisty, I am on the short, small side, and could have been overpowered by 2 men very easily. I don't know if they were having fun just taunting me, or if it was going to escalate to something else. All I know is that I was so lucky to make it home, and I believe that my guardian angel was looking after me that night. 2. This happened back in 2007, shortly after I turned 20 years old. I'm female, and at the time I lived in a small town about an hour outside of Washington, D.C. I grew up in that town. For the most part, I had always felt safe there, seeing how there was little to no crime and everyone knew each other. It wasn't uncommon for me to walk a mile from my house to my job. I didn't have a license at the time and, like I said before, it was a pretty safe area to live in. or so I had thought. At the time, I was working in a small cafe that opened pretty early in the morning in order to catch the morning commuters going to work in DC. On the day that the story takes place, I was in charge of opening the cafe, which meant that I was able to leave at 3 p.m. when the second shift was set to start. I was making my way down the familiar road that led me home. There is only one road that goes in and out of the town, and there is a sidewalk the length of the town limits. I was kinda in a hurry to get back home because I had forgotten my phone that day, and I was worried that I had missed some text from my friend. We were supposed to hang out after work, and she was supposed to text me when she was on her way to my house. As I was walking along, mentally berating myself for having left my phone, I noticed a car had slowed down to my left and was pulling to a stop on the shoulder a few feet ahead of me. I was about halfway home and didn't really think anything of it, so I kept walking. There were a few houses on the side of the road, and I figured that this person lived in one. As soon as I was right beside the car, the window rolled down and a man's voice called out to me. Being the totally naive country girl I was, I walked over to the car, figuring that maybe he was just another lost tourist, looking for his way back to the interstate. It wasn't until I approached the car and actually peered in that I realized how wrong I was. The car was in pretty bad shape inside and out. There was trash everywhere. One of the doors had been replaced with a door that was a completely different color. And the man inside didn't look much better. He was sweaty and his clothes were dirty, like he had been out all day working in the dirt. He asked me if I wanted a ride home, which I politely declined. I was halfway home, after all, and didn't really see the point. He asked me again, telling me that I was a pretty girl, and he wanted to give me a ride. Again, I told him no, and that I was fine walking. I backed away from the car and continued on my way. I thought everything was completely fine until I looked over and noticed that he was still on the shoulder of the road, but now he was slowly creeping along beside me. Every so often, he would shout out the window at me that I needed to get in the car, that he wanted to drive me home, or that I was too beautiful to be walking. I kept shouting at him to leave me alone and that I didn't want to ride. 3 cars had passed us at this point, and no one seemed to notice this odd behavior. His pleas gradually turned to demands as he angrily shouted for me to get into his car. I was starting to get even more scared by the second. I had almost made it to the road that led down to my house, but still had about a block to go. The man shouted at me to look at him when he talked to me. I turned to tell him to fuck off, but the sound immediately got stuck in my throat when I saw that he was exposing himself to me. I froze like a deer in headlights, at a complete loss for what to do. In my surprised state, he managed to block my path with his car by pulling into a driveway that was in front of me. That's when I freaked all the way out and tried to make a break for it with no other thought in my head but that I had to put some distance between me and him. I live right next door to a firehouse and knew that if I could make it there, someone could help me. I ran behind his car and around the side to get on the sidewalk again, and booked it down the street toward the firehouse. I threw a look behind me to see where the car was and started yelling when I saw that he had backed out of the driveway. He was still behind me, coming up fast. I turned into the drive that led up to the firehouse, still shouting, clutching at a stitch in my side. I threw another look behind me to see where the car was, and saw it as it drove right past the firehouse entrance. The guy had come out to see what all the shouting was about, as I was trying to climb the incline to the top of the hill where the firehouse sat. I was bent over, double, trying to catch my breath and sobbing by the time I reached him, in the middle of the drive. I explained to him as best I could, in between sobbing what had happened. I told him that I lived right next door, and asked if I could call my mom. He let me call my mom to come over, and then he called the police. I told the police everything that happened, what the guy had looked like, and what the car looked like, but they never found him. From that point on, my mom started driving me to work in the mornings, and my boss would drive me home after my shift. I never forget to take my phone with me now, and still have trouble walking to places alone. The thing that bothers me most is that 3 cars passed that day in both directions, and no one stopped. 3. Alright, so for background, I'm a first-year student at a large tech university. Our biggest rival is the state university. Since everyone and their mother goes to the state university, I have a lot of friends from high school scattered around campus, and I keep in contact with them pretty regularly. They've been asking me to go to a party with them, and I had to refuse because it wasn't feasible for me to take a weekend off from homework, etc. So rivalry week rolls around, and I figure now is the perfect time to visit the state school. I'm out for break and don't have any responsibilities, so I start asking around to see if there are any futons I can crash on, and one of my friends, a guy, Robert, offers his dorm. I've known this guy for several years, and I feel I can trust him, so I take him up on his offer. Robert is a really great host. He walks me to his dorm and helps me get all set up. And then, like college students do, he opens the handle of Everclear, and we get to putting a dent in it. Halfway through the night, Robert leaves to go to the bathroom. A minute later, the room door opens. I don't pay it much attention because I'm reading something with my back to the door, but after a while I notice Robert hasn't said anything. When I turn around, I find his roommate, Michael, standing in the doorway staring. Pretty weird, but I give him the benefit of the doubt, introduce myself, and apologize for intruding. He says it's alright and immediately hops onto his lofted bed to sit and talk. Robert comes back for a while and we're all talking and drinking and having fun. I'm sitting on the futon beneath Robert's bed. Robert is sitting on a chair and Michael is in his bed. But then Robert leaves again to take a shower. As soon as Robert leaves the room, Michael drops out of bed and is on the futon with me in 2 seconds. He has his arm around me and is uncomfortably close. I immediately shake his arm off my shoulders and tell him how inappropriate that was. He responds, "Yeah, oh well," and puts his arm back around me, but this time he's also leaning in, trying to kiss me. He manages to get his tongue halfway down my throat, before Robert comes back in and Michael immediately disengages and puts his head onto my lap to look inconspicuous. I can tell Robert thinks this is weird, but he doesn't say anything. I don't say anything because I know it's too late to find another dorm to sleep in for the night. Michael returns to his bed. After a while, it's time to go to bed. I bundle myself in a blanket and say goodnight to Robert, and lay down with my back to Michael. As soon as the lights are off and Robert is in bed, Michael slides onto the futon and puts his arm around my waist. I feign sleeplessness and try to push him off, but in reality I'm really freaked out. Michael leans in and whispers to me, "I think Robert is still awake, but maybe I'll come back once he's asleep. Wouldn't you like that?" I say that no, I wouldn't. But he just laughs and keeps his arm wrapped around me. After a second, I forcibly remove it and scoot as far away from him as possible. He pats my butt a few times before finally taking the hint and getting into his own bed. Most of that night I was laying awake, terrified that he was going to try to undress me, literally under my friend's nose. The next morning I woke up and dressed before either of them woke up, and headed out to find a different, more responsible friend with a less creepy roommate. But all throughout the day, Michael kept finding more and more of my social media, asking me where I was and if I was coming back. No, creepy roommate, I'm not coming back. In fact, let's never meet again. Hey everyone, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 197. Thank you very much to everyone who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Well, it looks like I'm going to start having to look through the Reddit archives again. Pickings are getting a little slim here. Don't worry, I'll get by somehow. Got plenty of paranormal stories and things like that, so if it's a slow week for the regular scary stories, I'll just double up on paranormal. We'll see what happens. Maybe this is a normal slow period for the Let's Not Meet, because the other subreddits actually seem not bad, but they seem about usual to me. So we'll see what happens with that, I guess. And we've got episode 200 coming up soon, so I'll need to think what I can do for that. I was thinking I could maybe find some multi-part stories Like I did the one big story for probably like I did with the last video, just a longer video than usual, but not like really long, not like 2 hours long. We'll see what happens with it. I haven't actually started looking yet, and it'll have to be out next week sometime, so I better get a move on. So that's what a good chunk of my free time will be spent doing this week, sorting that. On Thursday I will be busy though. I do have a funeral. One of my aunts passed away, so I'll have to go pay my respects on Thursday. But apart from that, it's going to be work, trying to get something decent organised for the 200th episode. And with that, I think I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.